Hey guys, welcome to your second lecture. This lecture, we're going to look at the three major perspectives. The theoretical perspectives that we're going to look at are the functionalist perspective, conflict perspective, and symbolic interactionist. These three different perspectives are ways to look at any topic that we might discuss in sociology. And it's a unique perspective on how to look at the different content that we'll get involved in. You guys have already heard me say that you're coming with your own unique experiences, your own beliefs, everything that you've ever had happen in your life. It basically builds up how you understand the events and the world around you. So really, pretty much everything is based off of perspective. A man on a desert island is going to look at a boat that's approaching and think that he has been saved, and a man lost at sea will see that deserted island and think, wow, he has been saved. It's all based off of perspective. So where you come from, how you've been raised, and what you've been exposed to builds up your understanding of the world. Since we all come from different perspectives, we have to find a way that we can agree on how different things are related within a society. So a theoretical perspective is a set of assumptions. A theory is a statement of how and why specific facts are related. So we're going to make assumptions as to why things exist in a society, why conflict exists in a society, why people choose or use different elements that we see present in a society. And we're going to accept that to be truth. Like I told you in the beginning, we'll talk about functionalism, or what's also known as the structural functional approach, conflict theory, or the conflict approach, and symbolic interactionism. And symbolic interactionism is the one that sounds the weirdest, but just see the word symbol in there and it helps you understand what it's going to look at. These different perspectives guide how someone is going to think about and research topics in sociology. What issues should be studied, how the facts that they look at, how they should be connected. And so there are very different ways of approaching the exact same topic, but coming up with different ideas about what that information means. The three major perspectives have 5 key concepts in common. The first one being functional integration, that each part or piece of society makes a contribution that allows the society to function together as a whole. Now, that sounds like it should fit more with functional perspective, but it does fit with the other two as well, that there are certain elements within a society that have to be present for that society to operate. The next is social structure. And when we're looking at social structures, we're looking at patterns of social behavior in a group or a society. And you'll hear people use that term social structure quite a bit. We'll use it in reference to family, to government, to the economy, to religion. That these are different structures, and they basically act as frameworks for us to have kind of an understanding of what our society expects. It cannot be seen, it's really very much an idea. So family is a social structure. What does that mean? Well, we have an idea of what a family should look like. Now, it doesn't mean that there aren't varieties of this, but as Americans, we still have kind of a tie into the old nuclear family, a father, a mother, and children. And if you wanted to modernize it, 2 adults and kids. That still seems to be our basic framework for family. And it helps us relate to other people. How do you know this is a social structure? Well, after you get through schooling and after you get through whatever it is that's going to be post-high school, the minute that you start stepping into that job or adulthood, the very next major milestone that people ask you about is, when are you going to get married and start a family? There's a certain understanding of what that means. Another key concept in all 3 of these is the concept of power. And power as a function, power as conflict, power as symbolic, the ability of one party to get other parties to do its will, or to ensure that it will benefit from the actions of other parties. Well, it's easier in conflict. Conflict theory, essentially at the heart of it, is that someone has power and someone doesn't. But in any society, power has to have a function, or otherwise it would be absent. And where we put that power and the amount of prestige or importance we give it is very symbolic. So, social media. Nowadays, social media is a great way to gain power. It gets your word out. It gets your story out. It gets you known to a group of people. And in fact, there are several famous people who are famous today because they were able to gain a following on social media. But even more so today, whoever gets the video out first tells the first story, and there's power in that. It starts to control the narrative that we listen to. Social actions are the ways in which someone's actions are coordinated with his or her environment. It's not hard for people in America to have the expectation of high school graduation. That seems very commonplace. Now you have to acknowledge that that wasn't always so. In fact, my grandmother got to 8th grade and that was enough for her. And I only have, I think, one grandparent that made it all the way through high school. But for my parents, the expectation was that they would graduate from high school. And now for your generation, really the expectation has morphed again, and it's almost like there's an expectation that you should just graduate from college. Our environment tells us we graduate from high school, and then we have the next phase. Do we go to college? Do we go to trade school? Do we go right into the job force? And then I could ask you, then what? And you guys should know the answer. After that, it's establish yourself, get an apartment or a house, get into a relationship that you are committed with and you have someone who wants to share your life. And then in our society, the next expectation is family, to have children or to continue to share your life with other people. Now, here's the thing. These are general guidelines. There are people who will not necessarily follow these actions the way that our society seems to want to dictate them. And then we come up with this question of what happens when they don't follow these guidelines. The last one is culture. Language, norms, values, beliefs, knowledge, symbols, the physical or material objects that we all share together that lets us know that we are from the same society, that we're of the same group. Now, societies can have a dominant culture and subcultures, but there's no such thing as a culture that has sub-societies. So there is the overreaching American culture that all of us subscribe to. We know what it means to be quote unquote American. However, you may exist in a subculture, and that might be defined by your race or your ethnicity, your religion, your orientation, but you can look at that and notice that there might be certain language, norms, values, beliefs, symbols, objects that that subculture also shares, and it makes you know that you're part of that group with those members. Functionalism is going to be our very first perspective that we look at. And it looks at society as this very large, complex organism that has to work together to remain stable. And since it is this kind of machine that works and all the parts and pieces are meant to work together, one change in one part can change other parts. So think of it as kind of an upgrade. If you upgrade one part, you might have to start to upgrade or change other parts in the system. So if we're looking at how technology has changed society, the easiest thing to point to is the cell phone. So we're not going to. We know that in the last 2 decades, cell phone technology has changed things dramatically, and we could have an entire course probably talking about that. But let's look at something a little simpler. Let's look at the vacuum cleaner. Today, if you want to clean your floors, you have a multitude of different kinds of vacuum cleaners, and they can do everything from wash and scrub to just pick up the dirt. If we think about how long it takes us to clean the floors in our home or run a vacuum cleaner across, it's probably a 10 minutes maybe per room type behavior, maybe even less. So we don't spend our lives cleaning our floors. But let's rewind the clock 100 years. 100 years ago, you probably had either wood floors, ceramic floors, or dirt floors. You probably didn't have carpet. And any area that you had that was carpeted was probably with an area rug. Well, the way that you would clean something like that, you would pick it up, you would take it outside, you would hang it over a line, and you would actually beat the dirt out of it. That could take an hour. And depending on how many rugs you had in your home, hours. Well, if that's just what you had to do to clean a rug, imagine putting on things like laundry or cooking without a microwave. Everything was much more labor intensive. So you would have seen 100 years ago, the role of women in our society was far more dedicated to domestic responsibilities. Now let's bring it forward, let's say 50 years. So now we're in the 1970s. Well, we have vacuum cleaners. We have women now entering the workforce, having more free time. Now, that's not directly related to vacuum cleaners, but a lot of those things that took up the majority of their time has now been freed up. We have washing machines, we have dryers, we have vacuum cleaners, we have different things that allow women to not have to focus solely on domestic responsibilities. So society has changed, right? Well, it has, but it's also remained somewhat stable. You still see mothers taking on the majority of the home care, the majority of the domestic responsibilities, and fathers still taking on the majority of the breadwinner responsibilities. And even when the mother is also working, they still, according to research, take on the lion's share of the domestic responsibilities. It hasn't shifted that greatly. Then we look at something like a microwave, and you go, okay, well, what has a microwave changed? Well, kids can stay home and cook for themselves without fear of necessarily burning down the house from the oven or the stove. It opened up allowing people to reheat and reuse food more efficiently. And it changed the way that we have packaged foods. In fact, frozen foods have lots of additives and preservatives, and you see right around the emergence of the microwave changes in American dietary patterns. When we still look at it, there's change from technology, but society itself still remains a pretty good facsimile of its original self. I mentioned before that functionalism assumes this kind of holistic nature of a society. It also assumes that societies return to states of stability even after upheaval. The 1960s is probably one of those great eras in American society where we see huge change, civil rights movement and the beginning of the women's rights movement. The changes were actually absorbed into our society. So now that we see women working in the workforce more often, almost to an equal rate of that of men, we still see that the difference between men and women in gender roles, especially within inside the household, hasn't really changed. So we absorb that change, but still have a very recognizable American system. Most aspects of society are there to promote survival and welfare. If they didn't allow us to survive, we would most likely get rid of them. Anything that is an intended consequence of a social pattern, it's meant to be there, is what we'd call a manifest function. Think about it in terms like this. Why do you go to school? What is the intended function? The intended function is very simple. Get an education. But are there things that happen while going to school that are not part of kind of the recognized and intended reason, but still happen regardless? We would call that a latent function. You go to school obviously to get an education, but one of those unintended consequences of this social pattern is we have peer relationships form, dating, friendships, cliques. You start to see social interaction. That's not the major function of school, or at least it's not the intended function, but you realize how important that socialization aspect is, and that's an unintended function of school. A dysfunction is any pattern that can disrupt the operation of a society. When we talk about social dysfunctions, divorce would be the dysfunction to marriage. And so when divorce rates rise, we start to see the operation of society start to kind of have to change in response to that. It disrupts the way the operation of a society happens. Now, you might sit there and question why, but if you have people divorce and you have single parent families, you have an increased need for things like childcare. You have kids who are latchkey kids and are left alone. You have a change in economic stability of the family. You have a lot of things that start to happen that weren't meant to be in the operation of that society. Functionalism also assumes that we share values, what we consider to be desirable, that there's a consensus. Values influence how you behave. If you believe that property is sacred, that you don't have the right to steal from other people, then your society will probably build a law around that. Stealing is illegal. So our values also start to become more complex as a society grows, and as that happens, we create more laws and rules that are supposed to embody the value systems of the people that live there. The second perspective that we'll look at is conflict approach. This is a political approach, and it's based off of Karl Marx's conflict theory. This says that society is always an arena of inequality, and that there's always trying to generate conflict and change. It's the absolute reverse of functionalism that stated that societies are trying to be stable. It looks at how different factors are linked to different or unequal distributions of things like money, education, and social prestige or power. This looks at a dominant group versus disadvantaged categories and assumes that those who are in that dominant category are going to do what they can to promote their own interests and maintain their power. Gender conflict approach is a subcategory of conflict theory, and it looks at inequalities and conflict between men and women. Now, I will say when we get into this topic, it's important to realize that you have to take things with a little bit of humor. Now, I like the cartoon, wow, I get to give birth and change diapers. Now, you can look at this and get very indignant and angry, but I actually think it's kind of funny because there's been a change since my mom was a kid to when I was a kid to even how you guys are being raised right now. My mom was born in 1951. For her to go all the way to college was actually abnormal, and she did. And she got a career and she had kids, and that was still somewhat abnormal. Me growing up, I got to go to college and I got to have a family too. And so the wow, I get to give birth and change diapers really doesn't bother me because I got to go to college. I got to have a fun career. I got to have a second career, and I got to have kids. It's when you get over to the readers. So as you move over to the other side of the screen, you see a boy and a girl, and one's playing football and one's cheerleading. And that doesn't really seem to bother us because it follows pretty much the stereotypes that more often than not, if you look at a football field, you will see boys. And more often than not, if you look at the cheerleaders, you will see girls. We don't really have a problem with this. This is a reader from roughly the 1940s and 50s. It's when you get to that bottom section. No one has a problem with boys or pilots, but we would change that statement today to say boys and girls can be pilots, or people can be pilots. Not so limiting. And then girls are stewardesses. Well, we don't even call them stewardesses anymore. We call them flight attendants because men and women can be flight attendants. You start to see a change in the way that we react to these kind of very basic things. We expect a much more accepting, broader thought process when it comes to careers. And that comes with gender conflict approach. Race conflict is another type of conflict analysis, and obviously it focuses on conflict between different racial and ethnic categories. It is important to note that Americans are not the only society that have race issues. This is something that exists in every society. So it may not be racial, it might be ethnic, but every society deals with conflict between different categories of people. Here you have an example from Canada. It's not what we would typically think of as an issue in our country, but here you have an issue with Native Americans and their presentation within advertising. The third and final perspective that we'll look at is symbolic interactionism. This one you want to see the word symbol. And so this brings it to a very kind of specific and much smaller focus, what we'd call a micro level orientation. It looks at patterns of social interactions in very specific settings. So society is a product of our everyday interactions and the individuals and the people that make up all of those. Where if we were looking at functionalist and conflict approach, they're talking about society as kind of this runaway machine that is either functioning or not functioning, but it keeps rolling regardless of who's involved in it. For symbolic interactionists, I could ask you a question like, why do people play sports? And some of you guys will say for physical health. Other people will say for the money that they get because they're professionals. Other people will say because they see it as a way to get into college, et cetera, et cetera. And it really depends on the group that you're talking about as to why they get into sports. A functionalist perspective would look at sports as a part of society that is there because it has a purpose, it gives something, it causes the society to be stable. Conflict would sit there and say sports are played by the people who can afford it, and therefore some people have and some people have not. To understand social interaction, you need to understand symbols. The way that we interact and work with each other is often based upon agreed meanings that we attach to symbols. Those symbols can be hand gestures, they can be facial expressions, they can be emojis, they can be something even far more symbolic. The meaning is determined by the people who create or use the symbol. And if everybody in a group doesn't share the same meaning, then you can start to have confusion. If I were to draw on a piece of paper a blue rectangle in the upper left-hand corner and then a bunch of red stripes and white stripes alternating on the rest of the empty space, even though I don't add stars into it, you guys would all see an American flag. And you would attach meaning to it. Pride, patriotism, something like that. If someone were to enter our group who did not share that same meaning, you could see either confusion or conflict result in that assessment of that symbol or the use of that symbol. It is interesting though that when we talk about this, if you go back to watching movies like National Treasure, most of us remember the part where they were looking at what looked like the swastika and they go back and they say, no, this was originally an Egyptian symbol. Well, the people who use the symbol get to determine its meaning, and if everyone agrees upon a different meaning, symbols can change. I want you guys all to think about kindergarten, the first time you sat around your teacher on the floor. And whether you were at Greenville or Ritchie, your teacher did some form of a hand gesture to get you all to be quiet. Now, they probably didn't put their fingers to their lips. They probably did something like the quiet dragon or something like that that was supposed to symbolize that you got quiet. The first couple of times that the teacher did that, they probably had to explain to you the meaning of the symbol. And you looked around to see how other people reacted. Once you learned the meaning of the symbol, you stopped speaking. And once you understood the meaning of the symbols, you started to imagine how other people would respond to that symbol. So that's when you started to see other kids making that hand gesture, maybe to get the class to be quiet if they were interrupting the teacher, or if they thought maybe you were going to get in trouble at lunch. It allows us to have internal conversations about how to behave and can allow us to change and alter our behavior once we understand the way everyone else interprets and understands symbols. Okay, so time for a quick summary. If we're looking at functionalism, we go with the idea that society is a system, an integrated whole, a machine, and all the parts have to work together for it to function. So everything exists in a society because it's supposed to. When something doesn't work, we would call it a dysfunction, and we would see that it would disrupt the operation of that machine. Second one is conflict, and this one says that there are people who have power, prestige, and wealth, and people who don't. And that the conflict comes that those who have power, prestige, and wealth want to maintain those things, while the people who don't are willing to fight to get them. Symbolic interactionism looks at the idea that depending on the very specific scenario that you're talking about, people will have different symbols and different ways of addressing issues. And so you need to look at the group and how they understand whatever it is that you're talking about and how they utilize it on a much more micro level. Those are your three big perspectives. We'll spend some time in class working with these and making sure that you guys are completely clear on it. Again, if you have any questions, always email me or speak to me when we are face-to-face or set up a Wednesday time.